finds only you, Lord. You are my best thought by day.
So, we're going to dive in starting in verse 4 today. This whole next section through verse 10 is examples of past judgment and salvation, which makes them a little bit different than Jude. Jude doesn't really mention past examples of salvation. So, Peter is writing to these churches to deal with the heretical apostates. We've talked about a little bit of their character. We'll come back to that probably 2 weeks from today. It'll get more into their problems. We've just seen basically that they're greedy. They like to exploit people. And in their exploitation of people, they're trying to convince people that judgment isn't going to happen. Peter is adamant that it is going to happen. And now he turns in verse 4 to examples of judgments in the past and argues what we talked about in Jude typologically. So we'll review typology and the types of judgment in the past and how they look forward to judgment in the future. The difference is between Peter and Jude, although they use similar examples, Peter is also going to give examples of God saving people. And I would like to get us through talking at least a little bit about Lot, because Lot's an interesting example of salvation. So let's read the passage. We're going to read all the way through verse 10a, but we're not going to get all the way through there, but this is the whole section. Peter says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. This is especially true of those who follow corrupt desires of the flesh and despise authority." So big picture stuff here. Peter's idea is that in the past, God judged the wicked and saved the righteous. So the same will apply at the future parousia of King Jesus. At his return, at his coming, when he's coming to judge, the same things that have happened in the past are going to happen in the future. Breaking it down, he uses 3 examples of Old Testament prophetic types that foretell the destruction of the people who reject his authority. And they're broken down as the second rebellion, which we talked about before, but we'll review here. The ancient world of the flood that the celestial rebels corrupted. And then the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So lots of stuff out of Genesis. But then he also turns to giving 2 types of those who are saved from judgment and condemnation. Noah and his 7 family members rescued from the flood. And then Lot, his 2 daughters, rescued from the destruction of Sodom. He doesn't mention his 2 daughters, but they're kind of implied. He sticks to Lot because Lot has a righteous character, despite the fact of what happens immediately after that.
And a wonderful uncle.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because his uncle is how you know he's righteous. So, first off, let's talk about types and antitypes. This is a review of Jude. A type is a nonverbal prophecy from the Old Testament. In its most basic form, that's what a type is. It's usually characters, stories, or examples that make a point about the future. They start seeing patterns in the Old Testament, the way things play out between different characters, different people groups and stories, and they start realizing that the cycles of history in the past tell you what God's going to do in the future. The word type is taken from Romans 15:4. Adam is a type. The Greek word is typos. You could also translate it pattern. I think the author of Hebrews doesn't specifically use the term, but he does the same thing very times, and it gets translated often shadow in the book of Hebrews, a shadow of the things to come, which is a different way of translating pattern ideas. I don't think type is the only word that he uses, and so they do some translated things, but the word and the idea of a Old Testament type is taken from how Paul uses it in Romans 5 about Adam for Jesus, and he specifically uses the word there. Other examples, David's a type of the Messianic king. I mean, this is exactly how Davidic prophecy works. whatever is the best qualities of David, the Messiah is going to have, but without all the negative qualities of David. The author of Hebrews uses Melchizedek as a type for the king priest Messiah, though I don't remember if he ever actually uses the word type. When I looked it up, I didn't find any examples of it. So I think he uses more of the term shadow. But it's the same idea. So that's the idea of the type. The antitype or antitype is just the New Testament person or corresponding reality to it. So the reality of Jesus as the Messianic King fulfills the Davidic type. You could also say archetype if you're thinking in Jungian archetypal literature. That's fair. It's not exactly the same thing, but there's a lot of overlap between those ideas. So you could think archetypically. Any questions on type and antitype? That should be reviewed from Jude. You'll see it in Romans. You'll see it in Hebrews. You'll see it in Jude and 2 Peter. They look at present and future realities by reading their Old Testament typologically. But if you're expecting that the prophets lay out every messianic detail in explicit prophetic literature, you're going to miss out on the Old Testament's overall picture and profile of the coming Messiah. So they're figuring this out in New Testament writings. Okay, now verse 4 begins, "For if God." This is an example of if-then literature, or protasis and apodosis. These are just the fancy terms for saying if, then. So he gives a protasis. If God, all the way through verse 8, does all of these things, then verse 9 we get the apodosis. Then the Lord, and he draws his theological conclusion. So I'm pointing this out today because we're not going to get to the then. We're not going to get to the apodosis today. Peter then gives the examples of past judgments to draw his conclusions for judgment and salvation. So we want to go through the past where God did certain things. God judged angels when they sinned, chaining them to Tartarus. So we need to talk about this Tartarus language, to be kept for judgment. God judged the entire corrupted ancient world with a flood. God saved Noah and his 7 family members from the flood. God judged Sodom and Gomorrah. He made them a proverbial example of future judgment. And then God rescued Lot from suffering the judgment of the cities, all 5 cities, not just Sodom and Gomorrah in particular, because he actually cared about the righteous. He cared about righteousness, and so God showed that he cared about Lot. It wasn't just Abraham's requests in the previous chapter. So if God has done all of these things in the past, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 examples, 3 of judgment, 2 of salvation, then it shows that in the future, God's intent is to rescue the righteous even while he judges the wicked. While he especially judges the sexually immoral and defiant rebels, that these heretics are. So this is the overall broad ideas. If you're going to go running off a cliff, then you're going to fall. If you're going to go an outright defilement of God's righteous wishes, you're going to suffer judgment. So his argument is really to deal with the heretics in the congregations of his day. Any questions on that? Good. It's not that hard of an idea. So let's start breaking down verse 4. If God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. This one statement alone, he's back to using Jude as his outline. Jude, of course, is also taking from Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Jude also borrows from 1 Enoch, heavily reliance there. But Peter doesn't show any reliance on 1 Enoch. He's using Genesis 4, and he's using Jude to pick the topics that he wants to talk about. So he's back to using Jude as an example, but he's not tied to Jude specifically. So his outline follows Jude's examples point by point, but he skips certain examples that Jude makes all the time.
So I need the same spark notes for Peter.
Sorry? Jude is kind of
the spark notes for 2 Peter.
If you want to think of it that way, I tend to think if you know Jude,
He expands so much on what he had already set out. So
That's true. He kind of does. What were you saying, Carla?
These examples seem to be repeatable examples from more than just Peter.
Yeah.
Why is it they chose those examples?
One, because they were
biggest?
they were the most popular. Hopefully, because his audience was already familiar with them. I think that's got a lot to do with what they picked. I also think Peter is picking the examples from Jude that help best make his argument that his audience is most likely to already grasp. So that because it's like you already believe these things from the book of Genesis, right? You're talking to these Christians. Moses is preached and taught in every synagogue, and that includes all the ones in Asia Minor. And so these Greek predominant churches have likely been influenced by Moses and are familiar enough with it that Peter can just hit the ideas and basically move on. Now, we'll talk about this. This actually works out because this language of hell is not hell, it's Tartarus, and that's Greek language. That's Greek background. And they have a background in this exact example from Greek stories. Peter is fusing, Peter didn't do this. Peter is engaging in a conversation 300 years old where the Jewish Mesopotamian stories that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 summarizes, the Greek background stories of Tartarus and the giants being cast, the Titans and the giants being cast by Zeus into Tartarus, these have been an ongoing collective conversation for 300 years. So for Peter, it helps pick this one example from Jude in Genesis 6 because they would have been very familiar with this from their own Greek stories. But he's leaning more to the Mesopotamian than Greek interpretation of the same stories. So, what I do want to emphasize is that although they're drawing from the same idea, Jude and Peter are both using this second rebellion to make slightly different points. Those points being that Jude is emphasizing the rebellion against divine order from these celestial rebels shacking up with human deities. That's what Jude is using the story to emphasize. Peter, so Jude uses that as a type of rebellious sin that's currently happening in his churches. Peter is using the story to emphasize the certainty of divine judgment for doing these things. So this is Jude's emphasis, this is Peter's, because the heretics in his church deny the coming judgment. So Peter is emphasizing the certainty of past judgment, which is why he basically refers to the angel's sin, and he doesn't elaborate any further the way that Jude does. Jude goes into detail about the sins of the celestials with humans. He goes into details with the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Peter's going to leave those details out because he's not interested in why they're being judged, just the reality that they were judged. Peter's attention is on the fact that God didn't spare celestials when they sinned. To not spare somebody is the opposite of showing mercy. God didn't actually show any mercy to the celestial rebels. He didn't intervene to exempt them from judgment because God doesn't play favorites. He doesn't save or seek to save humanity because he prefers humanity over a celestial family. God has one family made of human and celestials together. Anybody from any branch of his family, celestial or terrestrial, who sins against God, rebels against his good kingly wishes, is subject to his kingly justice. Question.
So you say that he doesn't play favorites, but is there some sort of example of the sacrificial offering of Jesus with the celestials? Because if he punishes them without any sort of opportunity for reprieve, then it seems like there is a preference given to humans because he gave them that option.
Perhaps it seems that way, but there are reasons we don't have time to go into now for why God sought to redeem humanity. And I'll just give you the broad scopes of it. One, when celestials rebel, they're rebelling in a far greater state of entrance into God's presence. Like their rebellion is far more deliberate. So God is holding them to a much stricter standard than humanity. But also, celestials rebelling doesn't negate the fact that he still has celestials on his side. When Adam and Eve sinned, the entire human race is now against God. If God is going to be proven correct about using humanity to expand his kingdom, to an extent, he has to choose to redeem them so that he can prove that he's right and that the serpent is wrong to try and lead humanity astray. So as far as the war between good and evil goes, there are reasons why God does one and does the other. But also, how do you atone for celestial sin? I mean, I don't know, because they're not physical beings. They don't have blood that can be spilled. I don't know how you do it. I don't know if God's incapable of it. I hesitate to say that. I just know that he doesn't. As soon as they rebel, they're done. And as soon as we rebel, we are also judged, but we also have the chance to return. I don't know any more as to why that is, other than those reasons that I've given you. And I think that's all the evidence we get in the Bible. So when the point of saying he doesn't play favorites is to saying whether you're celestial or whether you're a human, terrestrial, if you sin, you will be judged. Redemption may be offered to one and not the other. But I also, a third point is, I don't see any celestial rebels ever actually repenting of sin. So it's a non-issue because they don't actually choose to repent.
Yeah, but did humans repent before they were given the architecture to repent within?
Did they repent? No, they were judged, and in their judgment, they repent. Even when the celestials are judged by God because he doesn't play favorites, none of them ever seem to actually say, I'm sorry. None of them ever actually seem to ask for forgiveness. That's a third point that can be made about this. You will not find a celestial rebel admitting that they were wrong to do what they did. Ever.
But there's really not text to follow them after the judgment.
That is true. That is true. It is an argument from silence, and those are not good.
Hey, I thought about that some more.
But I will say, the profile the profile that we get of celestial rebels is that because they knowingly and consciously decided to do what they did, every decision that they make is doubling down on those choices, and they do not choose to turn away from them. That's it. That's as much as I can say about it. Humans, at least, when we screw up, we choose, some of us at least choose to turn away from our choices. And those God will redeem. There's no celestial evidence that a celestial rebel does that. Which is why, when God judges them, he does things like sending them to Tartarus, putting them in chains of judgment, which is what we want to talk about now. He sent them to hell. Okay? Stronger wording for this might be he handed them over, because the language is carrying judicial consequences in God's court. God convened court and judged them. This is a legal ruling. It wasn't an impulse. It wasn't a spur of the moment decision. God has anger and wrath, but he deals with it correctly. He brings all the witnesses and all the evidence into his courts. The evidence is seen, the court is convened, and they're found guilty. And the punishment is the execution on the criminals. Okay? So this is justice. This is not our wrath of saying, you insulted me, so now I'm going to hurt you.
Revenge.
Yeah, this is not human revenge. This is God's celestial justice against celestial people. Now, the NIV obscures the language here because it's not of hell, it's of Tartarus. The word is Tartarus. And Tartarus is not the general word for the underworld. Hades is the general word for the underworld. It's where all the souls descend when they die. It's the equivalent of Hebrew Sheol and Abaddon. Death, grave in Hebrew, personified as the place all souls go when they die. We've talked about metonymy before. This is metonymy for the same place. Anyways, Tartarus in Greek thought is the lowest place of the underworld. It's underneath Hades itself. It's a very specific compartment within the underworld. I say compartment because it's not a physical place, but no human knows how to describe a non-physical place except in physical realities. That's why heaven is pictured as being above us, the grave and death and Hades being below us. It's not literally below us. You're not going to dig into the ground or get in a spaceship and fly up to heaven, dig in the ground and find that. But they don't know how to describe a place without longitude and latitude, except in longitude and latitude, because that's all we know from our spatial awareness. So the Greeks have long described Tartarus as a part of the underworld, but the lowest part that's absolutely there.
So then that would make me come to the conclusion that there are levels in hell or Tartarus.
Yes. And I think the Bible is probably making this point.
Okay.
Whether...
I mean, hell is hell. Hell, Tartarus is hell. Someplace you don't want to be.
The idea of Tartarus in Greek thought, with Zeus at the highest point of Olympus, Tartarus is the farthest place away from Zeus as you can go. So here the idea is it's far away from God as you can possibly be. They're trying to picture that. So when they say these celestial rebels were thrown into the lowest, deepest, darkest pit and kept in chains, they are as far away from God as you can imagine them being. That's really all the language is.
Well, and in Greek mythology, everyone goes to Hades. It's not like good people are floating up to Mount Olympus.
Yeah.
Gods do not want them.
Yes.
So that's the realm of the gods.
Right. So
that's a problem with
you're
mythology.
thinking about Hades versus Tartarus, like Persephone is not going to Tartarus for 3 months.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
Yeah.
She's going to Hades and coming back.
Right.
Because Hades is just the way station.
Yeah. And
Iris is super into Greek mythology.
see, in the Old Testament pictures the grave in the same way. Everybody goes to the same place of the grave, and it took centuries for them to work out, well, the righteous and the wicked going to the same place doesn't make conceptual sense. So they start conceiving of a good place in Sheol and a bad place in Sheol. By the time of Jesus, it's kind of referred to in Jewish circles as Abraham's bosom, and he tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich righteous, or the poor righteous dies, goes to Abraham's bosom. The rich wicked goes to Sheol, Hades, and hell, Gehenna in Greek, and he's tortured there. Neither one of those places is describing the same place as Tartarus, right? And Peter specifically uses Tartarus. This is his language. It's the verb, actually, of the sentence. So within Tartarus, we're kept the giant offsprings with whom the gods warred in Greek mythology for Zeus to become king, create the cosmos as they presently exist under his rule. So the Titans and the giant offsprings, that is the pre-cosmic universal war that the gods fight and win so that they can create the cosmos as they currently are. They're all thrown into Tartarus. Then, as the universe is set up, the dead mortals get placed in Hades, where Hades rules. Okay? You can find references to this in the Iliad, where Zeus threatens to throw any of the gods who interfere with his plans. It's like, if you get in my way, I'll throw you into Tartarus as well. Do not disobey me in this. Hesiod's Theogony, I think I'm saying that right. Theogony? Theogony. Theogony sounds better. Whatever. He tells the story of the Titans' imprisonments in more narrative detail, so you can look that passage up if you wanted to. But let's talk a little bit about how the Jews are intertwining this with their Mesopotamian ideas in the book of Genesis. For the Jews, ancient Mesopotamian story adapted for Greek language of Greek Tartarus mythology. Look at the Sibylline Oracle, chapter 1. It's very early on. He says stuff like watchers, which is the same group. Watchers is the Aramaic word for sons of God in Genesis 6. Watchers were mighty, of great form, but nevertheless they went under the dread house of Tartarus, guarded by unbreakable bonds to make retribution, to Gehenna of terrible raging undying fire. Jesus' language of hell is Gehenna. He uses similar language of the Greek world to describe punishment for the wicked. Tartarus is the place where the Jews are working out their Mesopotamian ideas that go back hundreds of years, at least 300. I mean, 333 BC is about where Alexander conquers Palestine as far as the Greek-Roman Empire. So long before Peter and the apostles are writing, the Hebrews have already adopted Hellenistic ideas, and they've already adapted their Jewish, Hebraic, ancient Mesopotamian ideas to work in Greek, work in the Greek language, work in the Greek world, but they are pre-existing Mesopotamian concepts. In fact, the idea of the Nephilim giants, you could make, and some people have made this case, that the Nephilim giants, when in the flood, some of them escape and go west, and that you can actually trace the fall of Troy, the events of the Iliad, and the return in the people of the Philistines from the west during that era as being the remnants of the giant clan from this entire time period. There is actually some evidence of that. It's not conclusive, but that the biblical idea of the Nephilim giants, where they come from in Canaan, and the Philistines returning on there, are all remnants of the same giant clans from ancient Mesopotamia. And their literature plays out very similar stories with very similar ideas. I'm just throwing that out there. So there's pre-existing overlap between these ideas.
So, well, hang on. So the idea that someone survived the flood feeds that? Is that what I just heard?
Genesis 6 says there were Nephilims on earth both before and after the flood. You have to determine what that means. Because it doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you that, so some of the Nephilim survived the flood, or did more celestial rebels shack up with more women after the flood and create more Nephilim? Because I thought they were thrown into Tartarus. It doesn't give us an Old Testament timeline for when God actually did this.
Or maybe there were more celestials that said, hey, we're leaving too. But my point is, were there survivors of the flood outside of Noah and his family? That's the question it prompts when I hear that.
I don't know.
Does Scripture, I guess my question is, does Scripture speak to that? I'll have to look that up.
Apart from the Nephilim, no.
Okay.
If there was any survivors, it seems to imply that it was only Nephilim. If that. See, I don't know, because we're so used to... we're used to thinking of the flood as if the entire planet was flooded, but they don't have a concept of a planet.
Right.
At the very least, the flood narratives are trying to say wherever the kingdoms of the Nephilim were, God wiped them out. Does that mean he killed every last one of them? Okay. It seems to mean that. But lots of people are pointing out that the language is deliberately hyperbolic of the flood. That it doesn't need to be read literally. And I don't know how hyperbolic it is. I don't know how literally the flood narratives should be taken in great detail, because it doesn't tell us. It assumed the ancient people understood it and knew it, and doesn't explain it to us. So I'm open to both possibilities.
Right. But their idea is that they are out here, and if we never come to a conclusion about it, I don't think it'll impact.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't hang my faith on a timeline that the Bible doesn't give us. Right. I don't hang my faith on details the Bible doesn't give us.
Right.
I'm just pointing out that ancient Mesopotamia and Greek culture far to the west have a very similar set of stories from their ancient roots. That the Greeks know their ancient roots go back to Mesopotamia. If you read them in great detail, they know that. They don't really emphasize it, but they know it. And it could be that their culture and stuff to the west came out of the flood in some way, shape, or form. Though Jephthah's descendants after the flood seem to be where the Bible is pointing towards their narrative stories. Anyways, I want to walk through and summarize the story. This should be a bit of review from Jude, but let's just do it anyways. The story is that long before the coming of Alexander into the ancient Near East, the celestial rebels of the pre-flood war, summarized in 6:1-4 of Genesis, deliberately left their authorized places of habitation and power in heaven to go down to earth, deliberately create a rival kingdom by having children with women. Those children were quasi-divine hybrid giant race who fought and ruled as tyrants, oppressing humanity through violence. The celestial fathers also gave forbidden knowledge of metal crafting, making weapons and warfare. The notion of magic comes out of this. The creating of beauty products and the seduction of women comes out of this story in ancient Mesopotamians' ideas. The idea is that these celestial rebels, by giving information that humanity was either supposed to discover on their own and is not bad, or was either they were never supposed to know, depending on how you look at it, corrupted humanity. That it was not the fall of Genesis 3 that causes humans depravity. It was this rebellion spreading through illicit knowledge in human culture. Built a human culture of all the wrong principles, and it fundamentally accelerated the rebellion of humanity. So God uncreated the world by letting cosmic waters that he created the world out of reflood the world and then recede, and he remade the world through Noah and his sons. Genesis 6 through 9 is a judgment and recreation story in its entirety. So that's where they're getting the acceleration and corruption that we call human depravity out of this story, not Genesis 3. So in punishment for their crimes, the celestial rebels were cast as far away from God as it's possible to go. The lowest place of the underworld, the Greek word for which is Tartarus. The giants, Hebrew word is Nephilim, would die like their mortal kin, despite their great stature. They would rule, the world they ruled would be destroyed. It was just corrupted by their fathers, giving them illicit information. They rule in all the wrong ways. They don't care anything about God. Things got so bad that he destroyed the whole system and recreated it with the flood. That's the summary here. Peter and his Jewish compatriots and all the Greek compatriots know this story inside and out. This is everyday storytelling for them. We've already talked about most of this from Jude anyways, so this should just be review for us. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is just a summary of the stories everybody knew, which is why we don't get a whole lot of detail. And we have to go back and read other texts that bring it out and explain it to realize what Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is actually summarizing there. And I will also point out to you that it wasn't until after the second temple is destroyed and the Jews lose the Holy Land again after the Jewish-Roman wars and the Bar Kokhba revolts, so around like 110 AD, that the rabbis abandon this story and just claim that the sons of God are the sons of Seth. It wasn't until Augustine, 300 years after that Augustine didn't like the idea that celestial sons were sleeping with women. So he liked the Sethite idea, and that's when it became popular in church circles. But it didn't. The idea didn't even exist in Peter's day. There is only one interpretation of this story because there's only one story being told, and it's all the same story. No matter how far west, from your direction, west or east you go, they all have the same historical story. Peter is tapping into that by saying, they didn't get out of it. What makes you think you're going to get out of it? Now, it says he put them in chains to be held for judgment. What is this held for judgment idea? They're being held for the eschatological judgment, the true and final judgment of God that the heretical apostates say isn't going to happen. Peter says, your own stories, the things you people have believed say that it's going to happen. You know what they're not there necessarily being punished right now. It's a hell and Tartarus, Sheol and Abaddon are ways of referring to kind of a holding cell. While the second death, the lake of fire in Revelation, the final one, is the eternal punishment. It's not exactly clear all the time, depending on who's telling the story, if the present dead are suffering. Sometimes Jesus makes it sound like they are, and they could be. But even if they are now, what's coming for them in the future is still going to be far worse. when death and Hades itself are thrown into the lake of fire, there's no more need for a holding tank anymore. The jail cells are emptied out and everybody's executed for the second time. This kind of idea.
It's the ultimate wait till your father gets home.
Yeah, it is. The ultimate wait till your father gets home. So Peter's carrying along the story to emphasize that the judgment in which God will put the final end to all rebellious powers arrayed against him is finally going to come, and it's going to bring about everlasting peace for the righteous who stop rebelling.
Okay, question about that. Not what you just said, but like when we talk about throwing Hades and Tartarus into the lake of fire, does this indicate that there will be no secondary like stratification of judgment? Like everybody in there, they go into the lake of fire, or is there going?
That's a good question.
Second judgment that everyone would face in the end time.
I'll be honest.
If you get another chance.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
But like in the similar vein that we think of heaven as having like, okay, we're believers, we go to heaven, but our rewards in heaven may be different based upon our actions.
Right.
It stands to reason that there would be similar stratification in hell. Like, I didn't believe in Jesus, but I wanted Hitler. Do I get
like
too,
levels of punishment.
Right.
Got it.
Like, is this a misdemeanor or is this a felony?
It depends on the day of the week where I come down on that. I tend to believe in the different stratifications, I will say. I will say that John, when he describes in Revelation, he's being so emphatic and hyperbolic that I don't think I need to read John as saying everybody's going to end up with the same level of punishment. In a sense, that's true, but I don't expect it to be one, because he's looking at it from like a 10,000 foot up big picture notion. This is the end, and everybody who's on this side of the line gets the same judgment. But if he zoomed into it, which he doesn't bother doing, it probably would look different in detail based on other passages. He's just not doing that as an author.
Well, and I think it depends on whether you're talking about judgment and or punishment. The judgment is separation from God versus not separation from God. Punishment is, okay, here you are in the place that you put yourself in, but now there's going to be additional suffering because of your actions.
I suppose that could be true. I would guess even likely, but I don't know for sure. And
I'm not expecting you to.
So I want to be honest about that because this is details. They're details in which different authors are thinking and conceiving of them different ways. So it looks like they're talking about different things when they're talking about largely the same thing from different points of view. And it's also things that they've also never experienced before. And you have to take, this is why I say you don't read the Bible literally, you read the Bible literarily. You have to take each of them as different literary authors, trying to understand what they're saying. And then you have to take the composite pictures and realize what are they all saying in common, what are they saying differently, and what's the true corresponding reality. Ultimately, I don't think we can know the corresponding reality until we actually see it play out. So I don't put a whole lot of detailed stock into what it's going to look like, but we'll all figure it out when we see God do it.
Well, late then.
But it's also not
for them, not so late.
Well,
it's not our salvation now or then is not dependent on us knowing these details,
right.
Which is why I think God doesn't want us to know. He wants us to trust Him in the face of this, to work it out and to stay on His side until He does these things. And that's what we should do. Okay, couple of more slides here, and we'll just. Okay, I knew there was going to be questions for this, so it'll probably end up taking 3 weeks to get through this, but that's okay. I'd rather you ask your questions and and me try to answer them. And I realize this is not commonly taught stuff in churches, so I'm okay with slowing down for it.
Good. It is Sunday school.
Peter's whole point, yes, exactly. It's more your time than it is mine, but I want Peter's reality and truth to be known. That's all I care about. I don't care about the timeline of how long it takes to get there. So the point of Peter tapping into this in verse 4 is that he's making a typological judgment to come. The past judgment of the celestial sons means that he's going to do this again in the future for everybody who goes on rebelling. So that's his point. Past judicial actions against the godless is a guarantee of future judgment.
So Exhibit 1 or Exhibit A.
Yes,
Right.
and there are other exhibits, and we'll
Yes.
close with a few other exhibits here. Jubilees is a very good book for understanding how they perceive Genesis. We're not going to read all of this. I just want to read down here, which is why I separated it off. Jubilees is basically Jewish midrash on Genesis, meaning they expand it out and they talk about it and give commentary as they tell the story in Genesis. So while this is Genesis 6:1 through 4 is expanded in Jubilees 5 through 6. If you went through and you read that, it's the same thing, but they give you more details until you come to, this is about verse 5 and 6 down here. And against the angels whom he had sent upon the earth, he was exceedingly wroth, and he gave commandments to root them out of all their dominions, and he bade us to bind them in the depths of the earth. And behold, they are bound in the midst of them, and they are kept separate. So I think this is a celestial recapping the story here, because it sure sounds like, I don't remember specifically. A few other places that you could look up. Nope, sorry, those are future places for the flood. We'll talk about the flood next week, even though we've already talked about that. Let's just stop here. There are a lot, and when I say a lot, I mean pretty much all Jewish and a lot of Greek places where if you look at what the Jews were saying about Genesis 6, they have only one interpretation. It was not until after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Jews lose the land, and they reform Judaism into what is now Rabbinic Judaism, that they abandoned this idea. So Peter is only talking about one thing. The New Testament only affirms one interpretation of Genesis 6. In fact, in Revelation, where it says, I saw a mighty angel coming and he opened the key to the deep pit, and these scorpion-like things came out, could be a reference to these same guys getting out of prison long enough to re-corrupt the earth for final judgment. That's an entirely possible interpretation of that passage in Revelation. So it's a deeply, deeply important story to understand, and it's very, very difficult to understand. Dr. Michael Heiser, who's passed away almost 2 years ago now, his works on it are the most available, because he's a scholar, he wrote very scholastically, but he also tries to make it available for the layman. And anything he says on it, including just going to his YouTube page and watching his videos on it, are very, very helpful for understanding this stuff.